Good afternoon, our viewers at home. Good day, and welcome to another interesting episode of Insights from Eximators Legal. My name is Esther, the host of this series. Today we are enlightening ourselves on an interesting principle under the law and policy of the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is the law and policy of the World Trade Organization is actually a module under public international law, and it's actually quite interesting. So today we'll be discussing a very fundamental principle under the law and policy of the World Trade Organization, which is the national treatment principle. So we're going to enlighten ourselves on what this principle is, how it operates in practice when it comes to member states. However, before we go on to discuss the nitty-gritty of the national treatment principle, we want to lay certain premise and give us insight into the World Trade Organization, their objectives and functions. The World Trade Organization is actually the only global international organization dealing with the rules of trade between nations. At the heart of the World Trade Organization are the World Trade Organization agreements, several trade agreements which member states are contracting parties to. The goal of the World Trade Organization is actually to help producers of goods and services, exporters and importers conduct their business transnationally across borders. There are a number of ways of looking at the World Trade Organization. It's an organization for trade opening. It's a forum for governments to negotiate trade agreements. It's also a place for them to settle trade disputes. So when different contracting parties, member states that are conducting trades amongst countries, if there's a dispute, the World Trade Organization is also a place for parties to settle the trade disputes. It operates a system of trade rules, and essentially the World Trade Organization is a place where member governments try to sort out the trade problems they are facing with each other. So having said that, what are the policies of the World Trade Organization? The World Trade Organization agreement actually covers goods, services, and intellectual property. They spell out the principles of liberalization and the permitted exceptions across member states. The World Trade Organization is guided by certain major principles. Scholars have come to realize and establish that the World Trade Organization is guided by 5 principles which provide a general framework for working towards the eventual aim or objective of the organization, which is trade without discrimination, freer trade through negotiation between member states, predictability through binding and transparency, promoting fair competition amongst member states, and encouraging development and economic reform among member states. What are the important objectives of the World Trade Organization? One is to improve the standard of living of people in the member countries, to ensure full employment and broad increase in effective demand, to enlarge production and trade of goods. So there are transference of trade of goods and services between member nations. So it's not only the products alone, but also services, human services between member states. Also, another objective of the World Trade Organization is to increase the trade of services to ensure optimum optimization and utilization of world resources, to protect the environment, to accept the concept of sustainable development. We've seen a lot of issues about sustainable development, the debate about sustainable development, going on in this, particularly in this century now, based on globalization. We've seen issues of climate change, making the environment green. All those are part of the objectives of the World Trade Organization. So the main functions of the World Trade Organization are to implement rules and provisions related to trade policy review mechanism, to provide a platform to member countries to decide future strategies related to trade and tariff, to provide facilities for implementation, administration and operation of multilateral and bilateral agreements, of the world trade, to administer the rules and processes related to dispute settlement, to ensure the optimum use of world resources, and to assist international organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, the IBRD, World Bank, for establishing coherence in universal economic policy determination. So we see a lot of functions, and features of the World Trade Organization. Essentially, majorly, promote and provide a platform for member countries to do trades amongst themselves, to operate the tariffs, between member states, and to make sure that global goods and services are exchanged between member states. And obviously we can see that in reality in our world. So the overall objective of the World Trade Organization is to help its members use trade as a means to raise living standards, create jobs, and improve people's lives. So part of the objective of the World Trade Organization is what we see. Even it gives the opportunity for people to move between countries, country to countries, to go and work there, to go and render services there, to bring their goods into another country, to export goods from another country to another country that needs it. So the World Trade Organization operates the global system of trade rules and helps developing countries, especially also to build their trade capacity. So we have a couple of countries that are member states of the World Trade Organization, and it eases trade between those countries. Before we go into the national treatment principle, we want to actually, define a particular agreement, which we call the GATT, under the World Trade Organization. The GATT, the full meaning of the GATT is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. We're mentioning this agreement because the national treatment principle is actually entrenched in this agreement. So the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade covers international trade in goods. The workings of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade Agreements are the responsibility of the Council for Trade in Goods. So there's a Council of Trade in Goods within the World Trade Organization called the Goods Council, which is made up of representatives from all World Trade Organization member countries. So for the purpose of this discourse, we're going to be referring to World Trade Organization as the WTO. So, having mentioned the issue of the GATT, what is the national treatment principle? So the WTO's founding and guiding principles remain the pursuit of open borders, the guarantee of non-discriminatory treatment among members, and a commitment to transparency in the conduct of members' activities when it comes to trades and services. So the national treatment principle is the principle of giving others the same treatment as one's own nationals. So national treatment applies to imported goods once they enter the market, foreign and domestic services, and to foreign and local trademarks, copyrights, and patents. Like we said, the goods and services and intellectual property are covered by the World Trade Organization. So the national treatment principle is a principle that is a fundamental market access principle of the GATT, which we have defined above, or the WTO system. It imposes an obligation of like treatment, non-discrimination between domestic goods and imported goods. So it's a principle of giving the imported goods the same treatment as the domestic goods in the country in which it is sold, or giving imported services the same treatment as the domestic services in the country in which it is offered. So the national treatment principle applies to imported goods once they enter the market of that member state. That country where those goods have entered, regardless of the fact that they are imported, must be treated the same way as the domestic goods are being treated. It must not be discriminatory. So the national treatment rule prohibits countries from using domestic taxes and regulations to offset the value of tariff concessions, and is therefore a significant tool in promoting trade liberalization. So it encourages trade liberalization between different countries. So national treatment provisions are invoked mostly in a lot of WTO disputes. So when there are disputes between the member states brought before the WTO panels, if there's a dispute. The issue could actually be that the national treatment principle has been breached by that member state. Moving forward, with respect to goods, national treatment implies that once the imported products have cleared customs and the applicable tariff or duty has been collected at the ports, they must be treated the same as domestic products. So for instance, goods are imported from Australia into Nigeria. Once the goods have been cleared by customs, the applicable tariffs and duty have been paid on them. When these goods enter the market in Nigeria, they must be treated the same way as our domestic products. So the government or the Ministry of Trade in Nigeria cannot impose arbitrary taxes on those goods. If they are imposing the same tax on the domestic products, similar domestic products, like the imported product in Nigeria, it's the same percentage of tax that must, also be meted out on that imported goods. It's not going to be treated as if, okay, it's an imported good, so we're going to issue another higher tax on it or issue another higher tariff on it. No. That would be a breach of the national treatment principle. So national treatment principle is a feature of also the General Agreement on Trade in Services and many other trade agreements under the WTO system. The national treatment obligation is set out in Article 3 of the GATT. We have mentioned the GATT at the beginning, when we're discussing. And for the purpose of reiterating, the GATT means the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, Article 3, sets out the obligation of national treatment principle for every member state of the WTO. So the basic rule is that no law, regulation, or taxation pattern may adversely modify the conditions of competition between like imported goods and domestic products in the domestic market. So you cannot impose a higher law, a higher regulation, a higher taxation pattern on a similar imported goods, different from the domestic products in the domestic market. So let's take, for instance, toilet roll. We make toilet roll, using Nigeria as a case study, we make toilet roll locally in Nigeria. And yet, there are some imported toilet rolls. The same tariffs that are meted out on the local toilet roll produced within the country Nigeria must be the same imposed on the imported toilet rolls. It mustn't be that because it's imported into Nigeria, it's treated differently. That will be against the national treatment principle. So that's just the simple explanation of it. So what's the objective of the national treatment principle? It's actually to protect expectations of the contracting parties as to the competitive relationship between their products and those of the other contracting parties, to protect current trade and to create predictability needed to plan future trade. So you protect the expectation of the contracting parties that, yes, if my goods come into these member states, even though it's a foreign good, it's an imported product, as long as it's a similar product like a domestic product produced in that member state, it's not going to be treated differently. It's not going to be taxed differently or arbitrarily. Article 3 of GATT is generally interpreted to reach both actual and potential discrimination. So if a discrimination has been meted out in the now or in the future, Article 3 of the GATT covers it. Because Article 3 of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, like I've mentioned, sets out the obligation of the national treatment principle. So the national treatment obligation is a constraint that operates upon virtually any measure favoring domestic products or disfavoring imported products. I'll say that again. The national treatment obligation is a constraint that operates upon virtually any measure, whatever measure favors domestic products or disfavors imported products. So in a sense, if the similar domestic product is favored as against a similar imported product, then the national treatment obligation has been breached by that member state. And if the member state that imports the product into the country goes to the WTO, they can find in favor, of a breach of the national treatment obligation. We're going to discuss a case here, which we call the Korea beef case. It's actually a case in Korea that was brought before the WTO. And I believe this actually explains, what this national treatment principle is in practice. So the national treatment obligation scope was discussed at length in this case of the Korea beef case. So the appellate body considered, the appellate body is the appeal body of the WTO. It considered whether Korea is a country, as we all know. It considered whether Korea was infringing the national treatment obligation by maintaining a dual retail system for marketing beef that confined sales of imported beef to specialized stores. So actually, in this case, what actually happened was Korea accepts imported beef, but they also make local beef in terms of meat. So what the government did in this case was they created a dual retail system for marketing the beef. So the Korean law, in this case, created two distinct retail distribution systems for beef. One for domestic beef and another for imported beef. So in a sense, you have two retail distributions. There's an area where they sell the domestic beef. There's another area where they sell the imported beef. So if you want to buy imported beef, there's a market that you go to, within Korea or within the country, of Korea in that sense. So a large retailer could sell both domestic and imported beef as long as it maintained separate sales area. That was the rule, that the Korean law created in this case. So retailers selling imported beef were required to display a sign reading specialized imported beef store. That, in a sense, actually created a discrimination already, which obviously when we move forward, we see that the appellate body found a discrimination of the national treatment principle in this case. So the appellate body, in analyzing whether maintenance of the dual retail system violated Article 3 of the GATT, concluded that formal separation, of the stores actually does not in itself create the violation of the national treatment principle. So the fact that, okay, they created dual system of the stores, that wasn't what the appellate body found as what created a violation of the national treatment principle. So in itself, they're saying the national treatment principle was not infringed on because there was a dual store system. So it doesn't necessarily violate that national treatment principle. What, however, they found that was a violation was the key inquiry was to the effect that whether the maintenance of separate retail distribution systems for domestic and imported products modifies the conditions of competition in the Korean beef market to the disadvantage of the imported product. So what they found was the issue that was the contention or the key inquiry for the appellate body of the WTO in this case was the maintenance of the separate retail distribution systems in terms of, okay, where they sell domestic beef is different from where they sell imported beef. Does that system modify the conditions of competition in the Korean beef market that brings puts the imported product at a disadvantage. So this in turn depends upon the effect of the dual retail system. So what the appellate body found in that case was that the effect had been the reduction of retail outlets for imported beef, both in absolute terms and in comparison with the number of retail outlets for domestic beef. So this reduced the competitive opportunity of the imported beef in the Korean market, and they found that that was not consistent with the requirements of Article 3, sub 4 of the GATT. So that was why they found Korea, in that sense, liable for infringing the national treatment principle. So the rationale, as we have explained here, is, does the law of that member state put the imported product at a disadvantage as against the domestic product, a similar domestic product? So that's what has actually been explained, in that Korean beef market case. And I believe that case actually, gives the clear indication of what the national treatment principle actually seeks to protect. Having said that and established the national treatment principle, before we conclude, we want to actually give a crucial distinction between an element or principle of the World Trade Organization, which is called the most favored nation clause. What's the crucial distinction between the most favored nation clause and the national treatment principle? So the most favored nation treatment clause forbids discrimination among nationals of members. So it's an issue of no discrimination. So a country should not discriminate between its trading partners. So you cannot say, okay, yeah, Germany is most favored by Nigeria. So whatever goods that is a German product that comes into the Nigerian market is more highly favored than the goods that comes from the Italian market into Nigeria. No. As long as parties are member states, there is no most favored nation in the market. So a country should not discriminate between its trading partners. It gives equal opportunities, equal benefits to member states' products within its markets. The national treatment principle, however, says the country should not discriminate between its own products and foreign products or services or nationals. So there's a difference. The most favored nation treatment clause says countries don't discriminate amongst countries. As long as they are trading partners, they are trading partners. No company is superior to the other. The national treatment principle, however, says there should be no discrimination between the domestic products or domestic services and the foreign products or the foreign services, within the member states. So under the WTO agreements, countries cannot normally discriminate between their trading partners. Cannot grant another member state a special favor. So you cannot say you are lowering custom duty for goods coming in from, for instance, let's say Sudan into Nigeria, and you now increase duty for other goods coming in from other member states into Nigeria. You have to do the same for all the WTO members, their goods within your market. However, there are some exceptions allowed to the most favored nation clause, and I would like to point that out here. For example, where countries can set up a free trade agreement that applies only to goods traded within the group, discriminating against goods from outside. Or they can give developing countries special access to their markets. So maybe if they want to encourage goods from a certain developing country, let's take for instance, the United States can say, okay, any goods coming from Nigeria or any goods coming from Kenya, because we want to encourage, the imports from those countries, being member states, we want to lower the duty or tariffs that will be imposed on those goods. Those are exceptions, just for the purpose of creating a special access for those goods into their markets, maybe at the initial stages. or a country can raise barriers against products that are considered to be traded unfairly from specific countries. So if they feel that certain products are traded unfairly from specific countries, a country can raise the barrier and say, okay, yeah, we're going to impose higher taxes to discourage those goods from coming in. So in services, countries are allowed in limited circumstances to discriminate if it is going to be against their public policy. However, these are minimal exceptions to the most favored nation clause. So the most favored nation treatment clause means that at every time a country lowers a trade barrier or opens up its market, if it has to do so for the same goods or services, for all its trading partners, it does so for every of its trading partners, whether they are rich countries or poor countries, or they are weak countries or strong countries, or they are developing countries or developed nations. However, subject to those exceptions that we've mentioned. The national treatment principle, as we have explained, is treating foreigners and locals equally. So we can see the difference now. One is treating the trading partners in the same way, no favorability. The other one is treating foreign products, domestic products, the same way, no favorability. So imported and locally produced goods should be treated equally. That's the national treatment principle, at least after those goods have entered the market of that member state. So, in conclusion, it is worthy of note that national treatment principle only applies once the product, service, or item of intellectual property has entered the market of the member state. Therefore, charging customs duty on an import that is coming in is not a violation of the national treatment principle under the WTO, even if locally produced products are not charged an equivalent tax. So the customs, they can impose tariffs as long as those goods imported into the country are still in the ports. They have not entered the market. But the moment those goods enter the market, those foreign products enter the market, they cannot be taxed differently from the domestic products. So today, basically, we've been able to enlighten ourselves on this interesting principle of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which is the national treatment principle. This principle has actually generated, a lot of interesting discourse in the international scene, because a lot of disputes, that comes into the WTO system have actually been based on either an infringement, whether there's been an infringement of the national treatment principle, or there has been an infringement of the most favored nation clause, amongst member states. So we believe today we've learned something new in our episode of the Insights from Ex-Mentis Legal. We hope to see you next time with another interesting discourse. Thank you and God bless.